Thank you so much, Mr. Rolf Maier, for this interview. I know you have very limited time. You have a meeting with an ambassador in 45 minutes from now. We are in Johannesburg in November 2024. You were a member of the parliament from 1979 until 1997. And also, you were part of the negotiations team to end apartheid in South Africa. What do people need to know about what you went through, your negotiations with ANC?
Just to give a bit of context, and thank you for the opportunity. The apartheid regime existed from 1948 onwards, but there was a racial separation forever in South Africa. Right from the start, when the first Europeans landed on African soil, which was more than 300 years before. So what we had to dismantle, and what became very strongly realized during the 1980s, was this one-sided rule by the minority of white people that existed for so long. And it was very important to build on that realization to the extent that it became acceptable to think that change must happen. People like me, who was part of the National Party in Parliament over that period of the 1980s, started to advocate from within. At the beginning, maybe we were a small number, but it started to become more and more. The first tool I think I would like to reflect on is the fact that it has to happen from inside. It had to become a determined effort, the need for change.
So people within the regime must realize that the situation is not tenable and it has to change.
Absolutely. It doesn't mean that there is an end in sight yet. It doesn't mean that we had clarity on what would be the final outcome. It was just the realization that change must happen, and that almost became an obsession for people like myself to advocate for the change, to say apartheid must go. And we started to say it publicly. But certain steps had to follow. And that was, of course, very importantly in our case, the release of President Mandela from prison. Because by that stage, he was in prison already for more than 20 years. And he was seen from within, but also from the outside, as the main person to lead the ANC if there had to be negotiations.
So let's go back a little bit, because we're talking about 1990 now, when Nelson Mandela, the leader of African National Congress, was released from prison. You joined the parliament in 1979. What attracted you to politics? Why did you want to become a politician?
I think it was in my blood from the beginning. I grew up in an apartheid environment. My family were supporters of the National Party, and thereby also of the apartheid system. I grew up as a beneficiary of apartheid, undoubtedly so, because it was not only about racial segregation, it was also about white Afrikaner, the tribe that I come from, empowerment. And so to a large extent, my generation were the first beneficiaries of this. So there were no reasons why I would question apartheid until I got my senses.
You mean I got my senses?
When I was a young lawyer and had to give opinions on what is on the law book. And the realization came to my own mind to say, but what is on the law book in terms of the prescriptions as far as, for instance, at that stage, the so-called position of urban black people in the urban areas. Because the grand scheme of apartheid was that all black people have to exercise their political rights in the so-called homelands, or Bantustans, as it was called. In other words, regions outside the metropolitan areas. And then the question came to me as a lawyer to say, how do I interpret certain laws that's on the law book with regard to black people working in the urban areas and not being able to exercise their rights or any rights? And that is what started to develop the questioning in my own mind. And also the realization that apartheid is indefensible. That this is something that we can't tolerate.
Did you realize that the laws were unjust, or did you realize that the government was acting illegally?
I think it's both, because the laws came from the government, and you know, so one had to look behind it and say to oneself, where is this coming from, and how can we tolerate this? How can we work towards bringing about the change? I must admit, it was not as if it was, I realized this one day and the next day I was on the other side. It was an evolution as far as my own thinking is concerned.
So there was no aha moment?
There was no aha moment. And quite frankly, it was not necessary to have an aha moment, because it was a gradual process. Like, you know, nobody was really determined to stop apartheid yet. I'm talking about the 1970s. In the 1980s, after I got to Parliament, the situation started to change. And one can say that in the 1980s, we had our own Arab Spring period in South Africa, particularly from 1985 onwards, when the resistance movement against apartheid started to develop all sorts of methods inside the country towards protest and causing unrest. And that is what made more and more the country ungovernable. That was the policy of the resistance movement, make the country ungovernable. And I later on said they, to a large extent, succeeded. Because in that period, from 1985 onwards, I was inter alia Deputy Minister of Police. And it forced me to go to townships, black townships in the country, where I could see for myself what was wrong. And I could bring back a message to my superiors in government to say, what I observe is not protest against social conditions or service delivery or whatever. It's about politics. And that is what we had to change.
People felt humiliated. The majority felt humiliated, and they wanted freedom. They wanted to be treated as normal citizens of the country.
Absolutely. The point is this: the ANC, as the main resistance movement against apartheid, was started long before apartheid, or the name apartheid actually came into being. It was started in 1912, which makes it one of the oldest political organizations on the whole continent of Africa. And initially it was formed to advocate for black participation in government. And that was the policy, in other words, a peaceful policy that was exercised for decades thereafter. It was only in the 1960s that there was an addition to that, and that became known as a military wing that was established, also with the ANC in command to try and exercise obstructionist measures against the apartheid regime. It was not, quite frankly, too successful, but that changed slowly the whole approach. And like I said,
so when you talk about the Arab Spring in the 1980s in South Africa, are you talking about the peaceful protest, or you're talking about a combination of peaceful protest and armed struggle?
it was more peaceful than armed struggle, but it had elements of sabotage, for instance, and that added to the pressure that was exercised on the apartheid regime. But the real pressure came from the fact that it was peaceful protests and unrest.
But do you think the peaceful protest would be successful without the sabotage and acts of violence?
Most likely, yes, in our case. I'm not saying it's going to be everywhere the same. We're talking about the tools. I'm saying in our case, the peaceful protest was a very strong tool that was exercised. And remember, this was the ANC, as the liberation movement, was a banned organization at that stage. These peaceful protests were actually organized by civil society. There was an organization called the United Democratic Front, which one can say was a public arm of the ANC. But the fact is that it was a combination of a number of civil society actors, organizations that collaborated together in causing the problems for the apartheid regime.
Did the fact that young white people joined peaceful black and colored protesters contribute to the success of these protests? The fact that young people who were younger than you, but they enjoyed the fruit of apartheid, they enjoyed being white in South Africa, realized that this is not a just regime, the situation has to change. And then they demonstrated shoulder to shoulder with the black population and the colored people.
There were some that did it, but it was not a huge number of white people who did it. It was a marginal group, if I can say that. I think what was probably more important during the 1980s, during the protest time, was the realization on the side of the majority of white people that we can't carry on like this. And that's why I'm saying the protest movement was successful, because it contributed to the realization on the side of the white people, the majority of them, that we can't carry on like this. And that, combined with the external, the international pressure through sanctions and punitive measures, made the whole, it was a great combination from that point of view that forced the apartheid government to have a relook at the situation.
So let's discuss that a little bit. So in 1976, President Jimmy Carter came to power in America, and he made human rights as part of his priorities. And that changed the discourse about human rights all around the world, including in South Africa. But I believe in terms of South Africa, Carter was not very explicit in terms of his criticism of the apartheid regime. Would you tell us about the effect of Carter's administration on the discourse inside South Africa?
I think its real contribution was limited, but it certainly created an awareness more than existed before that time.
And he sent in a black ambassador.
He sent his black ambassador, Andrew Young, to South Africa. His special envoy to the United Nations at the time, was special representative. And Andrew Young came to South Africa, and just by the way, a year ago, I had the privilege. Andy Young is now in his 90s already, and I had the privilege to speak to him, and he told me the whole story about him coming to South Africa. I think it was around about 1979, maybe 1978, and having this meeting with P.W. Botha, was the apartheid regime's leader at the time. And yes, there was this type of interaction. It brought pressure, but the apartheid regime was still strong enough in its own view, at least in its own mind, not to listen too much to that pressure from Jimmy Carter or anywhere else. But truly, it created more awareness.
So strong enough, you mean economically, militarily, and in terms of its popularity with its core supporters, the white people. And then in the 1980s, more countries started to put sanctions against South Africa. What was the effect of that?
Let me just give the context again. In 1983, the apartheid regime under P.W. Botha started to make certain changes. It, for instance, brought in what is known in South Africa as representatives from the colored community into parliament, and also members from the Indian community, people of Indian origin in South Africa. So a system was created that was called the tricameral parliament, 3 separate houses for each of the groups, white, colored, and Indian. But black people were still left out. And that is actually where a real resistance started to grow and develop very, very very quickly from there onwards. Um, and, and this led to the Arab Spring 2 years later in 1985, the start of the Arab Spring in South Africa. And, and all these factors started to combine, but the apartheid regime could hold on to its power because it had a very strong and well-organized military, which was, by the way, at that stage engaged in a war in the north of what is now known as Namibia. Then it was called Southwest Africa. And that war was against Angola and supported by Cuban soldiers and supported by the Soviet Union, still as it was at that stage.
So at that time, more countries, they started to put sanctions against South Africa. And also, Oliver Tambo, who was the leader of ANC in exile, he went to America and he delivered a speech in the Congress. How effective were the sanctions, and how effective were the ANC leaders in terms of persuading other countries to impose sanctions?
I think here are 2 factors that really played an important role. And if one looks for tools, I think this is to be kept in mind. On the one side, the ANC was much stronger on the political and diplomatic side as with regard to a military or a paramilitary effort against the apartheid regime. And that political and diplomatic campaign was exercised by the ANC around the world in more countries and more cities than South Africa had official representation in terms of diplomatic missions. And so South Africa became more and more unpopular. and one can say that the ANC was very effective in mobilizing that international support. And I think this is something that one should also keep in mind as a specific tool. And then the second factor was the reaction from the international community by saying, there's only one way that we can change and force change in South Africa, and that is through punitive measures. So a broad debate about sanctions was leveraged in the international community, both at the bilateral level as well as at the multilateral level. The United Nations, for instance, started a campaign on that and made certain resolutions on that. But what was more important and with more effect was the individual sanctions, for instance, from the United States itself, which came about in 1986. And that Sanctions Act, I think, was, one can almost say, the final straw, because the apartheid regime's most important trade partner up to that stage was the United States. And suddenly that collapsed, that opportunity. And South Africa was suffering. The apartheid government was suffering as a result of that. And it escalated, of course, over the next number of years.
You were deputy chief of police during the apartheid regime for 2 years, you mentioned, and you traveled to different parts of the country. And of course, the intelligence agencies of South Africa, they were doing their own analysis and they were doing their own studies of the situation. How important were the intelligence agencies and intelligence agents in terms of convincing the officials that this situation is not tenable and it has to change and we have to do something else?
Very important. I think one can say that the assessments made by the intelligence agencies was first of all, more accurate than those that the politicians relied on, or would like to rely on, because they wanted to ignore most of the facts that were starting to develop. And so the assessments that was done by the intelligence agencies informed themselves, first of all, but also enabled them to bring forward those analyses to the government. And I was part of the receivers on the government side that listened to this and heard it, and that became more and more convinced that change is inevitable. So the main point about this, I think, is the role of intelligence behind the scenes, I think, is formidable for a very obvious reason, and that is their assessments are being done in confidence. It's not out in the public domain, and they can also share those analyses in a confidential way. So you have closed room discussions then as a result of that. But there's also the other important thing about the role of intelligence, and that is intelligence can be mandated to start talking across the board, across the barriers with people on the other side, which is exactly what happened in our case. It was the intelligence in South Africa that was mandated in the first instance to go and speak to Mr. Mandela in prison, and also to exile leaders in Europe. And that was a very important first step towards creating space for a possible negotiated settlement in South Africa.
Can you talk about this trajectory of reluctance to listen to the intelligence and then being more receptive to intelligence agents' recommendations on the side of the government?
I think the reluctance, no, let me put it differently. If you are in a position of authority as a government minister, and you are taking your job serious, then you listen to those that are bringing to you the required information on which final decisions have to be taken. And of course, the general advice from officials would present the status quo as it is. Intelligence has the ability to look further and deeper and more into the future. And I think their advice, therefore, in my experience, was accepted or relied on as more reliable and could be taken more serious. So my own experience was that if they came to us and said, there's a problem here, we have to look at it, we have to adjust policies, we have to adjust our own decisions up to that stage, then it was taken more serious because they could provide the facts and to substantiate their advice.
So the intelligence agencies, they didn't whitewash their analysis in order to satisfy the government officials. They gave them the facts as they were, and that somehow persuaded them to start negotiating with ANC leaders in exile and Nelson Mandela in prison.
Absolutely, that's spot on. I think that's an absolute correct analysis of how it unfolded in our own trajectory in South Africa. And this happened over not 1 day or 2 days or within a question of a week or two. It happened over a period of years. The first possible advice came maybe around 1987, and Mr. Mandela was only released in 1990, just to give the picture of the time that it took. But it was an ongoing process, but it was also enabling them, the intelligence representatives, to start a process of going deeper and further and meeting directly, which is very important because in a certain way that prepared the ground on both sides for developing trust, which is critical.
So someone from the government would go inside the prison, or a group maybe from the government. We're going to the prison where Mandela was kept and negotiating with. So that must take a lot of organization and also, I guess, secret operations, because that was not open to the public.
This was a very, very deep secret operation. Deep secret. I was not aware of it. I was a deputy minister, so I can say I was not necessarily entitled to that information. But it was so deep secret that only a few people knew about it, and it only came into public knowledge much later. But it was, looking back at it, it was a critical phase and step in that whole process of preparing the ground for change and getting people to realize it would make sense to sit around the table. And in as much as that message came to the government side, apartheid government side, I think it also helped Mr. Mandela to accept that the people who are coming to him are serious and genuine in their approaches. So it was working both ways. And
was negotiating on behalf of the government.
At that stage, it was Kobie Coetzee, who was the Minister of Justice and responsible for correctional facilities. And it was two officials from the intelligence sector, Neil Barnard, and the person who later became my key advisor, Fanny van der Merwe, who was, I think, head of prisons at that stage, or head of Department of Justice.
The negotiations.
They were later on, both of them, Neil Barnard and Fanny van der Merwe, were key members of our negotiating team eventually.
And at the same time, they were negotiating with ANC leaders outside.
This is pre-negotiations. This was just preparing the ground.
Just like a secret negotiation.
Yeah, that was preparing the ground. I don't think you can really call it negotiations. It was testing.
Okay.
That was talking.
Something that you always like to, the word that you always like to emphasize is the trust.
Yeah.
This was basically paving the ground for trusting each other and showing the seriousness, to the will to negotiate. Can you talk about the trust, and why do you think that is one of the most important elements in any kind of negotiations and any kind of transition?
Yeah, let me just, again for the context, describe the process that I have experienced, and I believe one should keep in mind also as a tool. That is, it all starts with talks. You and I are talking, and from every word that we express in this discussion, certain impressions came about and are imprinting in one's mind, and so just talk is very important. And then the next step is usually talks about talks. So if you and I talk today and we decide to talk tomorrow again, it means there is progress. And then out of that, a process of dialogue normally follows. And out of dialogue, then negotiations can start. So those are that's the framework for this. And I give this as the example to say that is how we build trust in the South African case as well. When Cyril Ramaphosa, who's our president today, who was the chief negotiator of the ANC, and I met the first time, it was just passing each other in an airport, international airport, by the way. It was Heathrow Airport in London. And we were, for the very first time, seeing each other in person. That was around about 1988, I think. Seeing each other in person, recognizing each other, and we shook hands. He was an enemy for me, and I was an enemy for him. But at least we had the curiosity. And I think that's another very key point. To build trust, you have to be curious. You have to find out more. Sometimes it leads to nothing because the other side is not acceptable to engage further. But if you're curious enough and you ask the right questions, you will get an answer at some point. yes or no towards building trust. And in our case, that was the moment where we shook hands and we said the same thing. And he later on said the same. So I must be, my memory is not failing me. When I said to him, we must talk, he said, we must talk. It's the same thing. And that led us to be more curious. And that, I think, is the starting point for building trust. Through that, at later stages, we met again, we saw each other, we started to engage further. So I think it's steps. You know each other, you ask questions, you respect each other, and out of that develop trust.
So the apartheid government realized that it needs to negotiate with ANC and Mandela. It realized that it's losing its popularity. It was subjected to sanctions. What persuaded ANC on the other side to start negotiating and saying that, no, we don't need negotiation with you. We're going to have a revolution and topple the apartheid regime, and we'll have a democratic Republic of South Africa for every citizen.
I think quietly the ANC also realized they're not going to win the battle, that it might end up in a civil war of a specific kind, not a big battle with tanks and big mobilization of armed forces, but a civil war which would be happening every day in the streets of South Africa, of people throwing stones and being shot, that type of thing. That would have been the civil war that would have escalated or came about in South Africa. And I think the ANC realized that it's unlikely that they would win that war because of the forces that the apartheid government could utilize. But I think Mr. Mandela, also in prison, while he was still in prison, realized that that would destroy the country if it would be carried out, that kind of civil war that I've explained.
So in order to preserve the sanctity of the country and in order to have a peaceful transition for everyone, they thought that ANC also thought that they have to negotiate with the apartheid.
I think that is what deeply started to emerge in the minds of ANC people. Maybe not all. They had their own internal differences, like we had our own internal differences. But the leadership under Oliver Tambo in London and Lusaka, where they were based, and Mr. Mandela in prison, I think the leadership slowly but surely decided a negotiated settlement is far better than trying to destroy the country or going the way of destructing the country.
How much do you think these really intelligent, brilliant characters contribute to this transition? Because you have Mandela, you have Oliver Tambo, you have Chris Hani, and these are not the characters that, appear in the world every few years or so. They're just very extraordinary characters. How much do you think these people and the fact that they were all at the same time leading the same movement contribute to this negotiations and peaceful transfer of power?
I think the point is this, and that is why I mentioned earlier on the ANC was formed in 1912. It had a long history and experience of how to build support from within. And that is why the ANC, by the time that we started the process, was worldwide recognized as the main anti-apartheid movement. There were plenty of others as well, but the ANC was the most important one, and it was recognized in that way because of its own capability of mobilizing that support internally, but also externally. And I think the leadership that they had was also the result of that long history. Mr. Mandela himself became active in the 1940s. Oliver Tambo the same. They were, by the way, very close partners in a law firm. And they themselves over that long extended period became recognizable inside but also outside. I mean, in the end, I can recall in the 1980s, wherever I went in the world, I was faced with one um, message from the outside, and that is free Mandela. And that shows how successful they were around the world.
You don't think that without the foreign pressure and outside pressure, the apartheid regime would fall?
No, I don't think it was going to happen then. Maybe later.
It would take much longer.
But at that stage, the four factors that played the most important role was the international sanctions, the way in which the ANC mobilized diplomatic and political support around the world, all over. It was very comprehensive. The third thing was the internal unrest that I described, and the fourth was the fact that the white people themselves, in the majority, started to realize we have to change.
And I guess the fifth factor is the fact that ANC was an experienced organization. Otherwise, they would not be able to be successful in the negotiations and have such brilliant negotiators.
That undoubtedly so. But that was almost consequential. But you're absolutely right. The ANC not only was successful in the negotiations, but they also brought to the negotiations very capable, qualified lawyers and legal minds that could help us to draft the constitution that we have.
So you were saying that wherever you were going, you would see the signs Free Mandela. And I remember in the 1980s, we had the Free Mandela concert, and there were demonstrations all around the world. And I guess that for you, it's also a personal ambition in your fight for toppling the regime and changing the regime, that to see Mandela free. Do you remember where you were and how did you feel when you saw him coming out of prison and holding William Mandela's hands?
Yeah, I can. It's in my in my whole system. I can remember it so clearly. That day when he was walking out, the 11th of February 1990, when he walked out of prison the first time we saw him in person, because for 27 years he was a nobody in terms of public image. And suddenly we saw him and we heard him for the first time. A lot of uncertainty, because we didn't know what he was going to say when he spoke the first time. There were no conditions for his release. That was the beauty. He didn't have to renounce violence or the armed struggle. He could walk out and start fresh. But we were not sure what that would mean. Despite the fact that there were conversations with him in prison, like I described, it was still not any condition for him to say certain things about the way forward. So I can recall that very much. The clarity of that moment is ingrained in my mind. But
Where were you?
I was at my home in Cape Town, my ministerial home that I occupied at that stage in Cape Town.
You were watching it on TV.
I was watching it on TV. Yeah.
How did you feel?
Well, on the one side, relief, but on the other side, a little bit of anxiety, as I described. Anxiety because the uncertainty. So the
But that speech alleviated your anxieties.
it definitely made it easier. I won't say the speech gave guarantees, but at least the speech didn't mobilize immediate reaction from the black masses or the black majority to come out to the streets and grab the opportunity and start mobilizing for power. It was the start of a new trajectory. So the relief was huge, because by then, at that stage, in my own mind, I was absolutely convinced of what is happening. It was not a question of, is this any longer a debating point, or debatable? it was necessary. It was absolutely a relief from that perspective. But how it would go forward, it meant a lot of work for us.
And I'm sure that you were in touch with many ANC leaders by that stage and many like friends or colleagues that you had. Did you sense a certain disappointment in the fact that Mandela was not combative? Because even now, when you talk to some black people in South Africa, they say that the whites didn't pay for what they did to us for so many decades. Did you feel some sort of disappointment about?
At that moment, not recognizable. There might have been, but I think the vast majority of people in South Africa felt relief. Also surprise, because they were not expecting it to happen. When FW de Klerk made that announcement on the 2nd of February, it was a complete surprise to the whole world. And the fact that it happened was immediately a big relief everywhere. The disappointment came later, much more recently. And if I can just say, I think what you described, yes, it's true. But unfortunately, it's a wrong interpretation of the situation. There's nothing that could have been done differently that would have caused less disappointment today. What I think is unfortunately the fact is that we should have done more in the last 30 years to address the basic problems of the country. And those basic problems were there then, and it's still here. And that is matters like poverty, unemployment, inequality, and so forth. And more should have been done in the last 30 years. We had the opportunity to address those. And it was not satisfactorily being attended to. But it's not the failure of the content of the Constitution. The Constitution is very clear in terms of its aspirations for all South Africans across the spectrum. You look at Chapter 2 of our Constitution, it's the most beautiful set of fundamental rights. And why are we failing people? It's because we didn't deliver on that. The government of the day didn't deliver on that.